25 years ago this month, Bobby Sands went on hunger strike in the Maze. 7 months later, when the strike ended, 10 Republican prisoners were dead. But none of the subsequent deaths had the impact of Sands.
100,000 people, 1/5 of the Catholic population of the province, attended Sands' funeral. The drama was played out in front of the world's press and television, but the government's position remained unchanged.
We have seen today the funeral of a man who took his own life, either by his own decision or because those behind him felt it was in the interest of their cause that he should die. And we shall shortly see, and the event deserves no less publicity, the funeral of Constable Ellis, a police officer who was murdered yesterday in Belfast in the course of his duties.
Well, there'll be a lot of activity in the months ahead as Republicans commemorate what for them was a painful but resounding victory over Margaret Thatcher. But did the strike really bring Irish freedom any closer? With me are one of the hunger strikers, Laurence McKeown, and the Ulster Unionist, Chris Magimsi. You're both welcome to Hearts and Minds. Laurence McKeown, you were taken off the strike when you had been in a coma for a couple of days. It was the 70th day of your strike. Did you ever wish that you had died?
No, I don't think I've ever wished that I would have died. I know when I recovered from the coma, at that point I was neither happy to be alive nor sad to be alive, but that was after 70 days of hunger strike. I was just physically and emotionally and psychologically drained at that stage. But no, certainly since then, and I mean, I've lived life to the full, and I mean, the thing I would say about all of those who died in hunger strike wanted to actually live. So no, never... sad that
I asked the question for the next question, which is, was it then worth it for those who did die?
Well, I mean, that question is asked often, and I mean, sometimes I find it maybe not a ridiculous question, with all due respect. But I mean, I think at the time we did what we believed that had to be done. I think it was the right decision. I think it was only one. I think that probably if it hadn't been for families intervening, then the hunger strike would have actually continued, because at that stage we were in a head-to-head locked battle between ourselves and the British government. And I think the thing to remember about it was, like, there was a protest for 5 years before it. The conditions we lived in had, I suppose, readied us, prepared us for that moment that came about. We had held off from a hunger strike for that length of time, even though it was always the sort of option that was thrown up simply because political status had originally been achieved under a hunger strike. So it was something that came about only at the end of a very, very long, arduous protest. And it was not just about the issue for us about criminalisation and about us being criminalised or the Republican struggle being criminalised. It also had a very practical dimension in the sense of how do we live the rest of our life in jail. So for us, I mean, it was, everything else had been exhausted. Cardinal V had been involved in talks. There had been a hunger strike in 1980 which ended when we thought that there was a resolution, and unfortunately that opportunity was totally scuppered, in my opinion, by the British government. But when it came to 81, it was, I mean, it literally was life and death for us. And that
you said that imprisonment gave you the time to learn, to debate, to criticise, and to apply the knowledge that you learned. Was the sum of that knowledge, though, not the futility of violence?
I suppose, unfortunately, if you look at, like, history, it's a history of violence, and I mean, I could turn around at the moment and say, did the British government not learn from the hunger strikes? Did they not learn from the whole involvement here? When you look at Iraq and what's going on there, when you look at the prison situation there, when you look at...
Yes, but if you look at where the Republican movement is now, having abandoned violence, is that not the lesson that you learned when you studied in prison?
No, to me the lesson, and it's particularly the lesson of the prison and the hunger strike, whenever there was a denial of the political issues there, whenever there was a denial of the political nature of the prisoners, regardless of what people thought of the IRA or not. I mean, one of the prison governors later said, I mean, the whole policy was a totally unmitigated disaster to try to take people who were highly politicised and disciplined and say they're criminals. What has to be looked at is the situation later on in the jails, whenever the policy of criminalisation was finally dropped, which wasn't actually until sort of late on in the 1980s. The prisons actually became a very quiet place. And similarly on the outside, whenever the political realities were identified, whenever the elected representatives of people, particularly from the Republican side, were actually treated as elected representatives and dealt with on the same level as everybody else, only then were we able to open up a space where people did move away from, in this case, armed struggle, but it was only when an alternative was produced, and there wasn't at that time in the prison, and there wasn't, unfortunately, on the outside, until much later.
Chris McGimsey, the hunger strikes politicised the whole nationalist community. What did it do to the Unionist, Protestant, Loyalist community?
Well, I think if hunger strikes did anything, it put into stark contrast the difference between the two communities. I mean, you see the Sands funeral and 100,000 people. I mean, you just had to go to a Linfield Glentoran soccer game and that to hear the sort of songs were being sung, to see that there was a sharp lack of sympathy for anything that the hunger strikers were involved in. And I think our feeling at that time within the Unionist and Loyalist community was that the IRA had manoeuvred themselves behind an 8-ball and we would just sit back and watch. And that was the feeling. But I don't remember any sympathy. I don't even remember sympathy from Loyalist prisoners' families particularly. And I think there was a feeling either that they were going to go in and it was going to be head-to-head with Thatcher, which was never a good thing to do, or alternatively, this was simply an exploitation of their young volunteers to try and kickstart the Sinn Féin political agenda.
Although I've read Loyalist prisoners who said while they were singing "Do You Want a Chicken Supper, Bobby Sands" in the H blocks, they were also admiring Republicans because they were doing something that they wouldn't have been able to do.
Well, I think there was might have been an element of that, because the Loyalists, of course, did try hunger strikes 2 or 3 times, and
there was no support for them.
No, and the hunger strikes tended only to last until dinner time. They didn't last more than a couple of days, to be honest. So I suppose there was a recognition. I remember talking to an ex-Loyalist prisoner years ago, and he said, I mean, you must admit the dedication of these guys. But I mean, it didn't show any great sympathy other than the guy. These guys are dedicated. A lot of people are dedicated to all sorts of very wrong and silly things, you know. But I mean, the other thing we must look at, which we recognise the way in which it politicised the Republican and the nationalist community, and it gave some unionists an opportunity to say, well, that shows that all Catholics are basically your closet IRA supporters, which of course is wrong.
Yeah, one quote again from a Loyalist prisoner said that there were now 230,000 legitimate targets.
Yeah, that's a sort of appalling analysis that people can come up with. I mean, that's nearly as many legitimate targets as the IRA thought they had. But, I mean, if it worked on one level in kickstarting Sinn Féin's political agenda, on another level, which was, of course, was the key goal, was hastening on United Ireland. I mean, it hasn't done that. I mean, what have we got? A 32-county board falch and a few other operations, but other than that, all political parties now recognise the legitimacy of Northern Ireland. And, I mean, and the union is not any weaker than it was then. So, on one level, politically, it might have worked for the Republican movement, but what is supposed to be their real goal, which is bringing about United Ireland, wasn't that successful.
I'm sure that's another question you're asked many times. I mean, did Bobby Sands and the other 9 men die for seats in the Assembly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a point that's put across, particularly by those who have parted company from the Republican movement. But I think they take
including the families of some of the hunger strikers.
Is that true? But I think it's I mean, if you take any point in history, and like and Chris was saying there, you know, whatever it was, a 32-county board fault or whatever. I mean, if you were to take the day after the hunger strike ended, you would have said it was a complete failure. I mean, we had 5 demands. We didn't get the 5 demands. We got one of them. So by anybody's standards, I mean, that's not. But if you looked at it in a much broader sense, then it was a massive victory. So I think it's always about how you look at it, at what point you look at it.
But looked at from now, do you still think it was a victory?
Well, I still think it was a victory, yes. I mean, I think that all has happened since then, and the process that has developed since then will eventually lead to United Ireland, despite what Chris was saying there. A much different process than what we would imagine whenever we were in the H blocks, or whenever we became involved in the struggle in the 1970s, certainly, and all that we learned in the blocks and developed and put into practice. I think a simplistic view, but you know, a hunger strike and a United Ireland, the two just doesn't weigh up. I mean, the hunger strike was a very specific period to bring about very specific goals. All of us have matured and developed since that, but more importantly, I said, none of it would have come about if there hadn't been a space opened up to allow politics to develop, and the Republican movement was seen to respond to that.
Just looking back at these demands, and I suppose we're entitled to do a bit of a history lesson 25 years on, the right not to wear a uniform, the right to do no prison work, the right for free association, the right to organise your own educational recreation facilities, the right to one visit, one letter, one parcel, 1 week. It seems such a trivial list of demands, doesn't it?
It does, and that's the reality of it.
It's unimaginable now.
Yeah. But I think that points out the fact that really the Republican movement were as determined to get into this hunger strike and into this head-to-head with Thatcher as Thatcher was. I mean, it's easy to print back and say, well, like, you know, reasonable demands. The Brits were unreasonable, therefore there had to be a hunger strike. I mean, I think the Republican movement were praying for a hunger strike. They needed it. I mean, that was exactly the sort of, I mean, you wouldn't have been, but I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing
But I
that
think
they saw as kick-starting, moving, as you say, the movement further on?
I think that's a line that comes out in hindsight. I mean, anything that was written at the time and seen about it, I mean, the IRA was totally opposed to a hunger strike at any time. They were opposed to enforcement. They were
Really,
absolutely
until
opposed.
Bobby Sands was elected. It was only after that that
This is even later,
the political focus came into it, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think it was only some people, even then, you know, started to see that there was an alternative way or a benefit or whatever else. But I mean, the thinking at that time, were it right or wrong, certainly within the IRA, was that the issue in jail was practically a distraction. It was taking up too much time, too much personnel, too much energy. Yes, supported the prisoners, all the rest of it, comrades and so forth, but no, the focus is we're a military war here. So even people starting to talk about, well, maybe there's a political road getting into elections. I mean, those debates had still to come and didn't come until, you know, sort of afterwards. I think what it did do was it catapulted, you know, that development within Sinn Féin, which was going to come about at some stage. But certainly at the time, you know, the idea that they wanted a hunger strike, because that was to put all your eggs in one basket, which was something that the IRA didn't want to do, the Republican movement didn't want to do.
So do unionists see the hunger strike as a defeat for Republicans still today?
No, I don't think it was a defeat. I don't think it was a defeat at all. I mean, I think that there was certainly the Republicans were able to secure benefits from the hunger strike. There's no doubt about that. And politically, actually, I think politically, the election of Owen Cairn is more significant than the election of Bobby Sands, because there was all sorts of the emotional stuff. I mean, remember the SDLP actually lost their bottom and didn't stand against Sands, whereas I mean against Cairn there was an SDLP candidate. So I mean, I think that it wasn't a defeat for the Republican movement. I think that the Republican movement were always, as they have frequently been able to do, they were able to take the situation and twist it around to their own ends and ensure that they got a successful benefit out of it. You know, I mean, one of the big things everybody said, of course, lots of people joined the IRA, or lots of people sympathise with the IRA. But that's what always happens in these situations. When Sean Kelly and his mates planted the Shankill bomb and killed a lot of people in our community, I mean, half the wee lads who weren't in the paramilitaries a week before joined it the week after. And that sort of thing happened in the Catholic community after when the hunger strikers started to die. But I mean, I think that we've got to recognise that it was significant, that it moved the situation on and it changed the agenda. I think we still have to analyse exactly where the key Republican leadership were thinking at that stage. I mean, hear Laurence's argument that that this was maybe a distraction, but I mean, I'm not sure that was really what they were thinking. I think this agenda has been moving a long time.
Well, gentlemen, there's going to be a lot more discussion along these lines in the months ahead. For the moment, thank you both very much indeed.